So now we've published our predictive experiment as a web service, we can actually call it. And the first thing we're going to want to do before we put it into production is test it. So let's look at some of the options for testing our web service. So here I am in the Web Services Management portal, and I can see my Diabetes Predictor web service. And let's go and take a look at that. And in this management portal, there's a number of things I can do, including I can click on this test tab here, and I can do some testing of my web service. Now, before we start, there's a couple of considerations here for working with our web service. You can actually call a web service in one of two ways. There's two different endpoints for our web service. One is a request response endpoint. In other words, we call it synchronously, and typically with only a single row of data that we want to predict, or a very small amount of data. And the other option is a batch endpoint, where we can send a whole pile of data to be used to generate predictions, and it will do that asynchronously, and we'll be able to get the results later. So we've got these two different options for our web service, and we can test both of those. So we'll start off by testing our request response. And you can see there's an interface here where I can enter in the various different values that I want to have for those different features that we're passing in. This is the input schema for our web service. So I could either type them in there, or alternatively there's the option to go into this CSV tab here and just type it in as a comma-separated value. So if I have specific values I want to test, I can just paste them in there, and I've got the column headings and then the values in the next row underneath. And I can go ahead and test the request response using that. And here's what I get back from the web service. So we called it synchronously, and we get back the physician, a diabetes prediction, which in this case is 0 or false, and the probability, which is the output schema that we defined for our web service. Now, if I wanted to test this in batch mode, then obviously we click batch here. And instead of entering in the data manually, we just go and browse for a file that contains the test data we want to use. So I actually have such a file. If we just go and take a look, there's a file here which contains just some data there for me to test. And we will go and browse to that file and just submit that. So we're ready to go and test using that file. And because this is an asynchronous batch job, we get this message here that we've not started that job. It's going to get queued, and then eventually it's going to run. So we could sit here and wait for it to run. I've actually already run one or two tests. So if we go to our batch request log tab here, here's all the previous runs, and in fact that current run that isn't started yet. And I can see the output from the previous runs, which I did with the same data. So we could just take a look at the output from that. And that's a CSV file, so we could just go ahead and open that up. And here's the output that I got from my test data. So I've got my physicians, my diabetes predictions, and my probabilities from that. So we can test it in both of those modes. Our batch mode test is going to take a little time to complete, and then we can download the results, or we can use the request response test to just simply test one row at a time synchronously and get the results immediately.